A house full of secrets. The haunting story of the Ashfords. You were never meant to hear this. Not now. Not ever. Because the moment you do, you can't go back. There are names the church erased. Rituals buried beneath stone. Whole bloodlines rewritten by men who wore cassocks by day and masks by night. But one name survived. Barely. The Ashfords. Not because they were noble. Not because they were powerful. Because they were dangerous. And the truth they carried, that was worse than death. This story isn't about ghosts. Not the ones that float. This is about the kind that sit behind power. That stare through history and feed on silence. So I'll ask you once, before we descend any further, are you ready to see what the world was designed to keep from you? Because this tale, this ritual of rot, begins not with murder but with obedience. In 1798, 3 women walked into the Maine wilderness, elegant, educated, untouched by frontier grime. They called themselves sisters, spoke like queens, moved like knives. Agatha, Prudence, Temperance. A trinity of virtue, they said. But the land they bought wasn't holy. It was soaked, ancient blood, pagan ash. Algonquin curses whispered to trees. And the convent they built, it wasn't made for prayer. It was made for control. Thick stone walls. High, narrow windows. Basements deeper than the frost line. Deeper than memory. Locals called it beautiful. Some said divine. But the dogs stopped barking when they passed it. And mothers locked their doors. What followed wasn't a story of healing. It was transformation. Of women into shadows. Of truth into silence. And it starts with one word, written in a forgotten priest's journal, a word translated from Latin. Delibero. It means to unmake. Now listen closely, because what they did in that stone cathedral of screams wasn't madness. It was methodology. The Ashfords were testing something. Something older than the Bible. Something buried under cathedrals and hiding in your textbooks. Stay. Because by the time we're done, you won't just understand history. You'll see who wrote it, and why they lied. They didn't call it a laboratory. They called it a sanctuary. But beneath the floorboards of the Ashford estate, a different kind of theology was practiced. One written in pain, not scripture. No one builds stone basements that deep without a reason. No one reinforces doors with steel bolts unless they expect someone or something to try to escape. You see, the Ashford women weren't just devout. They were doctrinal engineers. Prudence, the pale one with surgeon's hands, had studied under a Swiss doctor known only as Father L., a man exiled from Geneva for blasphemous experiments involving live dissections of the insane, and who disappeared in 1794, right after a fire consumed the sanatorium he operated in. Agatha, she had once attended secret philosophical salons in Sussex, gatherings of aristocrats who worshipped not God but order. They believed the human soul was programmable. That belief, loyalty. Even identity could be rewritten with the right tools: ritual, isolation, pain. What they created in Maine wasn't a convent. It was a template. A blueprint for turning deviance into obedience. For stripping the self away, layer by layer, until nothing remained but the will of the order and the subjects, young women, sent by their own families, under the noble lie of correction. They were the daughters who asked too many questions, the wives who refused to kneel, the girls who read forbidden books. And once they crossed the threshold of Ashford Stone, they were no longer daughters, no longer wives, no longer human in the way we understand it. The rituals began at dusk, no mirrors allowed, no clocks, no names. Every woman was given a number and a silence mask, leather with slits only for breath. If they resisted, they were drugged. If they screamed, no one heard. Because this wasn't punishment, it was preparation. preparation for a society dreamed of by those who would rule not with armies, but ideas. Ideas injected into the weak, willed until they confused their pain with salvation. And the Ashfords. They weren't just servants of this vision, they were architects. They believed suffering wasn't a flaw of God's creation. It was a feature. A necessary mechanism in the programming of obedience. By the time a woman left those walls, if she ever did, she was not the same. She remembered nothing. Or worsey, she remembered everything and could not speak. They called it the Sundering Room. It wasn't on any blueprint. Even Dr. Hartwell, their supposed medical partner, never saw its interior. But one survivor years later described it in a letter smuggled to a Boston priest, a letter so disturbing the church sealed it inside a red envelope marked anathema. That letter was found during a 1932 renovation of St. Elias Cathedral. It was burned within the hour, but not before a single line was copied. They don't erase your memories, they replace them with obedience. Understand what that means. It's not mind control, it's identity replacement, a technology disguised as faith. And it began centuries before the Ashfords, with Jesuit interrogation chambers in Venice and Babylonian sleep rituals practiced under moonlight. Agatha Ashford revived it. Temperance perfected it. Prudence executed it, literally. The Sundering Room had no altar, only a black chair, bolted to the floor, surrounded by mirrors, but facing inward, not outward. The subject was seated there for 13 hours. No sound, no light. Only the reflection of her own silhouette, multiplied endlessly until the brain collapsed under its own self-observation. They called it divine fragmentation. From there came the second phase, the recitation. A doctrine whispered through brass tubes into the subject's chamber. Not in English, not Latin, but a coded dialect that blended biblical verse with alchemical incantations. Words that didn't mean things. They did things. Linguistic triggers. Once the subject cracked, and she always cracked, she was moved to what they called the womb of order. A small, pitch black cell padded with scripture. Here, she was reborn, and the first voice she heard after days of deprivation, Mother Agatha's. Soft, warm, telling her who she was now, and that's how it worked. The Ashfords didn't need whips. They didn't need chains. They used ritual, light deprivation, sound programming, mirror trauma, and language, the oldest form of power. They didn't just silence women. They rewrote them, one syllable at a time. And if you're wondering why no one stopped them, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking who funded them. And why are those techniques still being used? Right now, in places far more modern than a stone convent? Because they are. They didn't die with the Ashfords. The techniques, the sundering, the recitation, the womb of order, didn't vanish into old stone and dirt. They evolved. They rebranded. They moved from candlelit cellars to fluorescent, lit labs from handwritten doctrine to algorithmic scripts. You've seen them. Not in robes. In white coats. They don't call it obedience induction anymore. They call it cognitive recalibration therapy. Funded through grants with titles like neuro, emotional correction, and behavioral realignment for noncompliant individuals. The rooms don't smell like incense. They smell like sterilized metal. The chair is still there. Only now it's molded from steel and polycarbonate, embedded with biometric sensors and EEG receivers. Mirrors are gone. Replaced with VR immersion chambers, 13 hours in total darkness. Now it's 4 days in virtual isolation. And the whispers. They've become synthetic voices, trained on your browsing history, your TikTok feed, your fears, your desires, your regrets. Yes, they know what will break you, and just like in Millbridge, they're still testing this on women first. in psychiatric correctional programs, juvenile detention centers, even wellness retreats disguised as empowerment camps. And who funds it now? Not a single Ashford coin, but private defense contractors, behavioral research wings at Ivy League universities, and think tanks with names like the Human Stability Foundation. One of their key advisors, a descendant of Dr. Samuel Hartwell, it's generational now, legacy knowledge, institutionalized, digitized. And you think it's just history. A macabre story buried beneath centuries of moss and bone. But it's not. It's a template. Copied, scaled, improved. And before you scoff, before you roll your eyes and return to your curated dopamine drip, ask yourself this. Why is it that after 40 years of constant war, cultural collapse, and media saturation, you still don't really know who you are? What's been done to you? How much of you was written by someone else? You were born with a name, but it wasn't your identity. It was an expectation. From your first cry, they began the inscription. Parents, teachers, screens, rituals disguised as routine. Be a good boy. Sit still. Don't talk back. Color inside the lines. They trained you in silence, not to think, but to comply. And every time you resisted, every time your wildness surged up from within, they didn't beat it out of you. They medicated it, labeled it, redirected it. And like the women in the sundering room, you weren't erased. You were overwritten. Piece by piece, a script was installed. What to wear, what to chase, what success looks like, who to love, who to fear, what to worship. They call it culture. We call it controlled mythos. And the thing is, it's not just the media. It's not just school. It's not even the state. It's the architecture of belief itself. You didn't arrive at your values. They were arranged for you, like stage props in a theater you never agreed to perform in. And every time you doubted the narrative, the system responded, not with guns, but with shame, isolation, public ridicule, shadow bans, job loss, character assassination. Sound familiar? It should. Because the tools haven't changed, only the interface. The Convent's stone walls have become digital echo chambers. The screaming is still there. It's just called comment sections now, and the recitation. It's your feed. Your algorithm knows how to trigger you better than your mother ever did. Better than your pastor. Better than your lover. Because it's been watching. Listening, calculating. That's why you scroll at 3 a.m., half numb, eyes dry, soul starving, but unable to stop. That's not freedom. That's a behavioral loop. And you're not broken. You're conditioned. But here's the dangerous part. You've felt it, haven't you? That glitch, that flicker, that moment when the story doesn't fit. That's your real self, clawing at the inside of the programming. Don't silence it. Feed it. They didn't just rewrite you. They hid the original manuscript beneath layers of programming so dense. Most men go their whole lives defending the very prison they were born into. Let's go deeper. Back to the blueprint. The original masculine archetype they tried to erase. Before governments, before corporations, before pulpits and prescribed salvation. There was something older, something raw, the sovereign man, unaligned, unowned, and untamed. You weren't meant to be agreeable. You weren't built to serve comfort. You were designed to protect, build, destroy, discern. But they couldn't control that. So they repackaged masculinity into cartoonish aggression or obedient utility. One they can laugh at, the other they can use. And when you didn't fit into either, you were called dangerous, toxic, unstable, or in need of correction. Just like the women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears. You were sent to your own version of the Ashford basement. They just called it school, or therapy, or rehabilitation. They didn't need leather straps. They used boredom, sedation, and social pressure. Punishment for curiosity, rewards for silence, and over time, your edges dulled. You started to nod when you should have questioned. You stayed seated when you should have stood. But here's the truth. The sovereign archetype never died. It went underground. It became legend. A whisper carried in war stories, bloodlines, and broken dreams. Buried in the texts they banned, locked behind the doors of secret societies, encoded in symbols and rituals they told you were oval. It survived in the myths, not the Disney ones, the real ones. The ones where gods were punished for bringing fire to men. Where serpents didn't lie. They offered liberation. You're not just waking up. You're remembering. That's why your hands shake when you hear this. That's why you feel the hairs rise when the puzzle starts to click. You're not crazy. You're coming online. And if you're still here, you're not like them. You're a watcher now. A man standing at the edge of memory and myth, peering down into the abyss they warned you never to approach. Next, we crack the floor beneath the Ashford sanctuary. But before that, type, I see the circle. Then type it again. Not just for the algorithm, but to claim your new initiation. They didn't need whips and chains to enslave the strongest among us. No, that was too obvious. They used something far more elegant. Something you'd never question. Mercy. Let that settle in your bones for a moment. Because what they told you was kindness was actually a velvet noose. What they framed as forgiveness was the final nail in your cognitive cage. You've seen it. The man breaks, loses everything, and instead of learning, he's told to surrender, to accept, to heal through guilt and compliance. They call it recovery. But it's really ritual erasure. The Ashford women mastered this long before psychology gave it clinical names. They realized pain can break a woman, but guilt would keep her broken. Those who screamed were not punished with beatings. They were drowned in remorse, locked in isolation, not for resistance, but for lack of progress. Do you see? They redefined rebellion as disease. Then they offered healing on their terms. This is how institutions keep control while wearing the mask of benevolence. It's how governments justify tyranny. It's how churches hide centuries of blood beneath white linens and whispered absolutions. It's how the Ashfords turned conversion into collapse. Let us help you, they said. But help came with conditions. Obedience, re-education, suppression of memory. Confession, not to a higher power, but to the very hands that bound them. And the modern world has taken that model and perfected it. They offer you programs, support groups, new identities. But they come at a cost: your fire, your instinct, your birthright to rage against the machine. You weren't meant to apologize for your power. You were meant to refine it. Mercy is not always a virtue. Sometimes, it's a trapdoor, a way to lead the lion into a cage by whispering that it's tired. And when you step through that door, you don't hear it lock because they've already convinced you that the cell is safer than the hunt. But not you. You're starting to taste the lie in every soft hand that tries to guide you back to sleep. They didn't just want obedience. They wanted transformation, but not the kind you imagine. Not ascension. Not enlightenment. Reconstruction. The Ashford blueprint wasn't just about controlling women. It was about testing methods. Systemic psychological dismantling. Step-by-step reassembly. They were perfecting something scalable, something portable. What began in that convent, behind stone walls and beneath candlelight, was the prototype for modern institutional programming. They isolated subjects, controlled food, light, temperature, language, sensory manipulation, emotional dependency, and most importantly, narrative override. Each woman was given a new story. You are broken. You are being saved. You are safe now. You belong to us. The same phrases, over and over, until even the strongest forgot what they'd once believed. This is not just history. This is operational science. When the Ashfords realized physical pain had limits, they shifted to repetition, deprivation, love, bombing, and memory erasure. This wasn't about religion. It was about systems of belief, how to tear them down and install new ones. Sound familiar? Look around. What do you think happens in elite boarding schools? Rehab clinics, certain therapy programs. They've cleaned up the branding, but the process remains. You enter with fire. You leave with obedience and a certificate of healing. They weren't healing the women. They were deleting the wildness. That untamed, ancestral, feminine chaos that once danced with wolves and whispered spells beneath moonlight. They turned witches into wives, warriors into weepers. And they did it through language, repetition, and ritual. You think that's just the past? Your TV does it now. Your phone, your scroll feed, your self-help guru. Everywhere, someone is trying to tell you who you are. So let me ask you, who were you before they gave you your name? Because that's who they're trying to erase. And if you feel something stirring, something ancient, something fierce, you're not broken. You're remembering. What if I told you the Ashford Sisters didn't disappear? Not really. Not fully. The building eventually collapsed into ruin. The forest swallowed the stones. The records were sealed, then lost. But their methods, they multiplied. Because someone was watching, taking notes, paying attention. By the late 1800s, similar retreats began to surface in elite circles, quietly funded by families with names you'd recognize. Rockefeller, Morgan, Astor. They weren't run by nuns anymore. They were run by scientists, doctors, philanthropists. And the language changed too. No more talk of sin. Now it was maladjustment, hysteria, neurasthenia. But the rooms looked the same. Cold, white, soundproof. And the treatments, still based on isolation, repetition, and carefully curated identity erasure. Let me be clear. This isn't theory. These programs existed, and still do. They've just changed their masks. They call them wellness centers, behavioral health institutes, rehabilitation for the spiritually fractured. You've seen them. You just didn't know what you were looking at. Think about this. Why do so many rich families send their children to secluded programs in the mountains? Why do celebrities vanish for months, only to return with the same vacant calm? Why are so many of these facilities founded by old families, ones with ties to occult societies, eugenics, and colonial medicine? Because the Ashford legacy is alive, refined, hidden, and legalized. You think MK Ultra was the beginning. It was just a midpoint. The real blueprint came earlier, from women in veils with surgical tools and holy books. And you want to know the most terrifying part? These modern programs don't just erase people. They install new archetypes. The obedient daughter, the grateful survivor, the man who no longer questions the system that breaks him. They tell you that your suffering was necessary, that your rebirth is proof of their mercy. They thank you for letting them destroy who you were. So let me ask you now, have you ever been somewhere where you left feeling emptier than when you arrived? Not healed, just quieter. That wasn't healing. That was programming. Let's talk about grief as programming. Because that's how it works now. You don't need stone walls and scalpels when you can fracture someone from the inside and let their own trauma become the leash that tethers them. The modern institution doesn't scream in your face. It nods, smiles, offers you tea. It says, "Well, understand you've suffered. But to get better, you must let go of the version of yourself that resisted. Let go, let go, let go. They repeat it until you do. You cry, they record. You confess, they transcribe. You collapse, they clap. And when it's done, you leave with new words in your mouth. I'm so grateful. They really helped me. I was broken before. But you weren't broken. You were angry. You were aware. You were asking too many questions. And for that, they had to grind you down. Here's the truth. These healing centers were designed not to cure, but to convert. Not to soothe, but to reconstruct you in the image of someone easier to manage. Someone polite, apologetic, disconnected from their fire. And they do it through a system. One as old as the Ashford basement. Step 1, isolate. They strip you of everything familiar. Friends, phones, freedom. Step 2, deconstruct. They confront you with your shame over and over until your memories become weapons you turn on yourself. Step 3, rhyme print. Once you're hollow, they install a new narrative. They call it insight. But it's indoctrination with better branding. This isn't therapy. It's alchemical warfare, turning gold into lead. Still think this is about the past? Look up the foundations that fund these centers. Trace their origins. You'll find old names. Ashford adjacent. Patrons of mental hygiene. Believers in social order through personal compliance. And now I need to ask something of you. If you're still here, still listening, comment below with this phrase 2 times. They broke the body to blind the mind. They broke the body to blind the mind. Say it twice. Seal it. Lock in who you're becoming. Because we're not just watching a story unfold. We're recovering pieces of ourselves they tried to erase. You were never supposed to notice the pattern. Not in the schools. Not in the sermons. Not on your screen. But once you do, it's everywhere. What began in the Ashford basement didn't die with the sisters. It evolved. It adapted. It spread. The surgical table became the chalkboard. The restraints became curriculum. The soft voice of authority became your inner monologue. Let's start with education. The Prussian model of schooling, praised globally, was not designed to create thinkers. It was built to create obedient workers. The original intent: train children to sit still, follow orders, memorize state-approved content, and accept external grading as the measure of self-worth. Sound familiar? The bell doesn't ring for freedom. It rings to simulate factories. The rows aren't for collaboration. They're for surveillance. Now layer in history classes that omit rebellion, literature that praises quiet suffering, and science that never questions its funding source. You thought you were learning truth. You were learning compliance. Then comes religion. The fire and brimstone model is outdated. Now they offer soft guilt, therapeutic sermons, and community as a leash. Churches that look more like corporations. Leaders who smile as they drain your autonomy. They sell salvation, but only if you confess how broken you are. Only if you submit. And don't even get me started on entertainment. Hollywood didn't just inherit the Ashford philosophy. It weaponized it. Look closer at your favorite characters. How many are punished for independence? How often does the strong woman end up either dead, humiliated, or apologizing? How many storylines tell you, speak up and suffer, obey and be loved? They've normalized humiliation. They've romanticized control. They've made submission sexy. You were taught what to fear, what to desire, and what to forget. All by people you'll never meet, answering to organizations with roots older than your nation. Many of them tied by blood or ideology to names like Ashford. This isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Ashfords didn't disappear. They changed surnames. They entered the universities. They traded crucifixes for credentials. By the mid-1800s, One descendant, Elias Ashford, had become a rising star in the field of moral physiology, not medicine, not theology, but something far more sinister, the science of controlling behavior under the guise of diagnosing it. Elias didn't wear robes like Agatha. He wore a waistcoat and spectacles. He published in journals instead of diaries. But the goals remained the same. Separate the disobedient from the obedient. Redefine rebellion as disease. Label the soul and lock it away. His most infamous paper, never taught today, but archived in Yale's forbidden stacks, was titled Temperament and Corrective Classification, a Framework for Institutional Harmony. It's a masterpiece of manipulation. He proposed that certain personality types were innately dangerous to social cohesion, particularly women with excessive verbal ability, men who exhibited suspicion of hierarchy, and children who displayed imaginative resistance. A sound familiar? That legacy mutated into modern psychological diagnostics: oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, borderline personality. Not all science is false, but not all labels are neutral. Many were engineered, seeded by ideologies obsessed with obedience, rooted in eugenics, funded by elites who wanted control systems that didn't look like chains. Elias Ashford helped found what would eventually become part of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. What began as a tool for treatment became a weapon for sorting. A map of the human mind that conveniently outlawed certain thoughts, not because they were dangerous, but because they threatened the existing order. You were never supposed to question why normal means dull compliance, why abnormal often looks like rebellion, or why those who don't fit are medicated, marginalized, or institutionalized. The Ashfords figured out early. You don't need walls to create a prison. You just need enough mirrors and convince people they're broken. This section isn't just about history. It's about you. How many labels have they tried to pin on you? How many times did you feel wrong for simply seeing the cracks in their system? Let's go back to the building itself. The Convent of Eternal Tears wasn't just built to hold women. It was built to transform them, not in body, but in mind, in soul, in identity. The architecture wasn't religious. It was ritualistic. And if you understand symbols, if you see what the average man misses, then you'll recognize the fingerprints of something far older than Christianity, etched into every stone, every hall, every chamber of that cursed place. Start with the floor plan. 3 concentric rings, outer dormitories, inner sanctum, and a central void. It mirrors the Dantean Inferno, a descent from outer sin to inner guilt to a final core obliteration of self. Each layer had increasing restrictions on light, time, and noise. Women progressed inward as they improved. But in truth, they were being broken, deprived of external anchors. No windows, no clocks, no sound beyond controlled chance. Their sense of time, of identity, of reality itself began to dissolve. Now focus on the symbols carved above the doorframes. Not crosses, not saints, but spirals. Serpents devouring their own tails, pagan glyphs, alchemical signs, drawn from pre-Christian mystery schools. The kind that promised transformation through annihilation. Even the chapel, the supposed heart of the convent, wasn't designed for worship. It was built downward, not upward. A reverse cathedral. Instead of ascending toward heaven, it sank into the ground, each step deeper into ritual silence. Its ceiling was low, its walls pressing inward, not inspiring awe, but triggering submission. At the very center, a stone chair, not a pulpit, and it wasn't for the sisters, it was for the patients. They were forced to sit in it for hours, surrounded by mirrors, symbols, and whispered recitations. Not sermons, scripts. indoctrination cloaked in compassion. The design used isolation, repetition, and symbol exposure, 3 ancient tools of mental reprogramming. And here's the dark truth. These techniques didn't die with the Ashfords. They evolved. Today, they appear in institutional therapy, in military training, even in education. The spaces you walk through now, offices, schools, clinics, are descendants of this architecture. White walls, controlled lighting, repetitive sounds, mirrors, and always surveillance. This is ritual programming. Not with robes and chants, but with forms, lights, and gentle voices that guide you toward compliance. You think you're healing, but you're being reconstructed. In 1931, during an unauthorized excavation beneath the ruins of the Convent of Eternal Tears, a ledger was discovered, bound in human skin, sealed with wax bearing the sigil of a serpent biting its tail, Ouroboros. The state archivists who received it never released its contents, not because it lacked value, but because it contained truths no one was willing to confront. You're about to hear what no official channel has ever dared read aloud. Not a diary, not a list, but a system, psychological programming disguised as care. This was ritual science, centuries ahead of its time. Patient entry, subject 9F delivered at 17, unmarried, rebellious, literate, exhibits independent thought. Phase 1, isolation. Denial of name, referred to only as a vessel. Day 14, cessation of verbal output begins. No use of personal pronouns. Responds only to instruction. Subject shows early signs of identity erosion. Day 90, subject reports dreams of drowning in mirrors. Interprets silence as divine judgment. Initiate phase 2, symbol induction. This is where it becomes darker. Each subject was assigned a symbol, carved into their personal items, written on their clothing, and whispered during sleep deprivation. The symbols weren't random, they were sigils, drawn from Babylonian, Sumerian, and Hermetic traditions. Each one crafted to break the psyche's resistance. Subject 12B, exposed to spiral glyph concordia, refuses food, weeps without provocation, begins reciting non-existent scripture in Latin. Day 15, initiate phase 3, physical reset, hair removed. Renaming ritual subject becomes obedientia. Let that settle in. They weren't just changing behavior, they were rewriting souls. Over 300 women are recorded in that ledger. Only 48 were ever seen again. Of those 48, none remembered their names. The notes go further. Some subjects were recycled, stripped, reset, and made into sisters themselves. Yes, it's likely that Sister Prudence was once a patient, transformed from victim to enforcer. And what about today? Clinical notes in modern institutions carry echoes of this same language. Patient exhibits oppositional behavior, failure to respond to standard reward systems, receptive to guided renaming and affirmation. Do you see it now? The ledger was not simply a record. It was a blueprint for controlling deviance, restructuring identity, and ensuring obedience under the guise of healing. But here's the part that matters most. They thought no one would ever read it. They thought we'd forget. They were wrong. They didn't just vanish when the convent burned. The Ashford method, their system of psychic dismantling and soul reassembly, was never destroyed. It was adopted, rebranded, globalized, and hidden beneath layers of charity, progress, and medical ethics. We traced it. Not through headlines, not through government records, but through symbology, language patterns, and survivor testimony so fractured, even therapists called it delusion. But they weren't delusions. They were scrambled truths, because that's what ritual programming does. It splinters memory, reframes guilt, implants obedience, and turns rebellion into ritual compliance. The organization today, it doesn't wear veils or call itself a convent. It goes by a far more respectable name, the Institute for Behavioral Reformation. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? Sounds helpful. But behind that polished veneer, clinical forms, white coats, smiling photos of transformed lives, lives the same doctrine Agatha Ashford wrote in blood. The soul must be stripped before it can be made holy. The Institute operates globally now, under various shells, mental health retreats, rehabilitation centers, elite education consulting firms, but their structure, it's identical to the Convent of Eternal Tears. 3 tiers: isolation, indoctrination, identity replacement. The building plans are nearly exact: square symmetry for containment, no central hallway, high windows, stone interiors, and controlled sound environments. They call it therapeutic architecture. But it's not. It's ritual design. One of their most active facilities today, in upstate New York, private land, barbed wire perimeter, listed as a wellness retreat. But the clients don't leave reviews. The staff doesn't post photos. And every month, a black van arrives. No markings, just transfers. From where? From courts. From families with influence. From institutions that want problem children, removed from public records. And just like the Ashfords, the Institute promises transformation. But the price is silence, obedience, and erasure. You don't believe me? Look up their symbol. It's a stylized spiral inside a circle, just like what was found carved into the ash floor beneath the convent ruins. Only now it has a name. The Path to Harmony. They didn't disappear, they mutated. After the convent burned, after the Ashford name was scrubbed from public record, a new lineage emerged, not by blood alone, but by ideological inheritance. And that legacy took root in a place few would ever think to look. The Bavarian Medical Society for Neural Reform, founded in 1821. Their founding charter, we've obtained fragments, contains word for word excerpts from the journals of Prudence Ashford, translated into German, then Latin. Same phrases, same obsession with obedience as salvation, same surgical diagrams we thought were lost in the fire. The society was closed to the public, invitation only, and among the earliest members was a man named Heinrich Ascher von Stein, a psychological theologian and retired surgeon whose family name mysteriously disappears from German records after 1836, until it reappears in Brooklyn 1843 on the immigration manifest of one Henry Ashton. And Ashton isn't just a coincidence. It's a derivation, a cleaned version of Ashford, carefully chosen to pass in Protestant America without suspicion. But the bloodline, still intact. Henry Ashton founded what he called the Order of Sanctified Cognition, a secretive society of mental health reformers that believed trauma was the true path to enlightenment. Their belief. The mind must be purged of rebellion through calculated disorientation, disconnection from family, faith, language, even reality itself. And where did they set up their first institution? Sullivan County, New York. The same region where today's Institute for Behavioral Reformation stands. Same land, same layout, same 3-tier system. The group has since changed names a dozen times, from Cognitive Ascension League in 1912 to Inner Sanctum Wellness Trust in 1956 to the current institute, sterilized in language, but ritualistic in operation. And their board still traces back to House Ashton, a private trust headquartered in Switzerland. Untouchable, untraceable. But in a rare legal filing leaked in 1998, the trust listed its founder not as Henry Ashton, but as Agatha Ashford, Matron Emeritus, eternal seat. She never died in the fire, or maybe she did. But the name, the role, the power was never meant to die. It was meant to transcend bodies, to live on through title, through ritual, through systems that still harvest disobedience and remake it in silence. If you've ever wondered why the same patterns repeat in different institutions. Why so many of them speak in the same sterile language while enforcing absolute obedience. It's because they were never truly different. They were descendants, clones, ritual offspring of a system built centuries ago. The initiation rites of modern psychological fraternities aren't modern at all. In 2021, a defector from a high-level, cognitive leadership fellowship leaked a 72-page internal manual used to induct rising behavioral scientists into what they were told was a prestigious inner circle. It was filled with abstract psychometric jargon, thresholds of compliance, moral malleability indicators, neurological resilience quotients. But hidden in the footnotes no one was supposed to read, were citations from Agatha Ashford's journals, translated from old ecclesiastical English. The subjects must first be isolated, then segmented by reflective contradiction. Ritual correction follows. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what the Ashfords practiced in the basement of the Convent of Eternal Tears. They called it cognitive reformation through divine isolation. Today, it's simply rebranded as trauma, responsive therapy, or dissociative state reintegration. But the bones are the same. The altar just wears a lab coat now. In certain Ivy League-backed societies, cloaked as research initiatives, new members are blindfolded and led through simulated confinement chambers. The lighting, the echo, the whispered liturgy are designed to reproduce the conditions of the original Ashford basement. It's not symbolic. It's procedural. A mental reformatting designed to erase defiance and implant institutional loyalty. That's why certain graduates of these programs can rise so fast. They're not just compliant, they're ritually imprinted. One chant, used consistently across these hidden rites, was preserved by a survivor: purity through silence, clarity through pain. Obedience is freedom. I'll say it again. Let it echo in your mind. Now imagine that whispered to a 17-year-old recruit, deprived of sleep, disoriented, desperate to belong. They're not training scientists. They're cultivating priests of a new psychological religion, one rooted in control, disassociation, and ritual. And who signs the accreditation for many of these institutions? The Ashton Trust. Same bloodline, same fortress. Just wearing different skin. Look past the polished websites and sleek mission statements of today's top behavioral research firms, and you'll find something more ancient, more deliberate, lurking beneath the surface. These aren't just institutions of science. They are modern sanctuaries of behavioral orthodoxy, designed to mold, measure, and master the human will. Take Neuropharma Group, for example, a neurocognitive consultancy that trains corporate and governmental leaders in emotional control, team compliance, and mass influence. On paper, they're revolutionary, cutting-edge brain analytics, pattern recognition algorithms, biometric empathy mapping. But deep inside their executive structure lies a lesser-known department called Division V, a name that appears nowhere in public disclosures, but turns up repeatedly in the travel logs of certain academic consultants, all of whom trace back to one place: Millbridge. Now ask yourself, why does a modern neuroconsulting firm based in Manhattan own land in the Maine wilderness, precisely 2.6 miles from the original site of the Convent of Eternal Tears? Because the rituals never died, they evolved. Division V's confidential research contracts reference something called the penitent cycle, an 18-day behavioral regression sequence used to purify decision-making units and prepare them for strategic recalibration. That's corporate jargon. But the structure, identical to the spiritual trials enforced by the Ashford Sisters. 3 phases: isolation, contradiction, obedience. You think we've come a long way from stone-walled convents? We've just wrapped them in glass and chrome. What's more terrifying is this. Many of the techniques now used in behavior modification programs, from rehab centers to executive retreats, are built on unpublished documents originating from the Ashford archives. Documents recovered not by historians, but by corporate archaeologists, funded by entities that want to operationalize ancient methods of psychological purification. That's the phrase they use. Operationalize. They're not looking to understand history. They're trying to repeat it in silence, in boardrooms, in therapist offices, in classroom behavior charts and digital wellness apps. The Ashfords created the blueprint. Division V just wears a better suit. And they're everywhere. Advising presidents, restructuring schools, crafting the next wave of a resilience training for your children. But here's the truth they won't say aloud. The convent never closed. It just franchised. Do you remember the first time you were told to sit still? Not asked, ordered. The first time your hand was slapped away from a curious object. The first time your laughter was silenced because this is not the time for jokes. The first time your question was met not with an answer, but a glare. Most men brush it off as childhood discipline. But what if I told you? That wasn't just a teacher keeping order. It was programming. A system designed to create the compliant citizen, the obedient worker, the ashamed man, and it traces back, once again, to the Ashfords. In 1821, 2 decades after the Convent of Eternal Tears closed its doors, a series of education, reform guidelines, were quietly submitted to the Massachusetts Board of Education. The author listed was a doctor, Samuel Hartwell. Yes, the very same physician who collaborated with the Ashfords in Millbridge. His proposals emphasized 3 ideas. Disruption is a moral failing. Authority must be internalized through repetition. Shame is the most efficient corrective tool. Sound familiar? Today we call them behavior charts, color systems, detention, but the bones are the same. Hartwell's model, once applied to hysterical women in the forest, was now being deployed on 6-year-olds in public schoolrooms. The goal wasn't just education, it was conformity. Desks lined in rows, bells signaling obedience, silence in the face of contradiction. What was once a convent for psychological purification became the blueprint for compulsory schooling. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. The very first national teacher training curriculum in America, adopted in 1845, contains whole paragraphs word for word from the Ashford manuscripts. This wasn't education reform. It was mass initiation. Children, stripped of their wildness, broken down by the repetition of control. The curious punished, the bold pathologized, the creative labeled as problems. And it worked. Generation by generation. We forgot that learning could be joyous. That movement was natural. That rebellion was holy. We were conditioned, not educated. Ask yourself, how much of who you think you are was shaped by a system designed to break spirits? By the time you finish this section, an algorithm will know more about your attention span than your parents ever did. You were trained to accept it from the very systems that were supposed to teach you. In the late 1990s, the digitization of the classroom was sold as progress. Laptops in every home, smartboards in every school. But beneath the buzzwords and press releases was something far more calculated, real-time behavioral data collection. It began subtly. Attendance logs, quiz scores, progress reports sent to parents. But soon, platforms emerged that could track eye movement, keystroke speed, hesitation timing, even facial micro-expressions during tests. What used to be a nun's judgmental gaze in the Convent of Eternal Tears is now a webcam silently watching your child's every blink. Do you see it now? The architecture of psychological control has simply updated its interface. Where stone walls once kept disobedience contained, digital firewalls now trap the psyche inside feedback loops of evaluation and reward. Gamified learning, public leaderboards, gold stars turned into digital badges, good boys and quiet girls, ranked by machine logic. And here's the kicker: parents are now the willing enforcers. In 1820, a family paid silver to have their daughters' will broken. Today, they pay monthly subscriptions to track their child's every academic breath. They check dashboards like stock tickers, obsessing over metrics that were designed to reduce the human spirit to numbers. You think the Ashfords vanished? No, they just evolved. Their methods now wear the face of progress, equity, innovation. But the skeleton is unchanged: control the mind by shaping the environment, reward conformity, pathologize rebellion, and surveil the soul until it forgets how to fight. We live in a house built on secrets, and our children are being raised inside digital convents, more effective than stone ever was. You think you make your own choices. You think you scroll, tap, follow by, because you want to. But in the hollow chambers where the Ashfords once whispered to trembling penitents, a new voice echoes: data priests in silicon robes, masked in the algorithms of convenience. This is no longer religion. It's predictive psychology. It's neural mapping. It's behavioral cloning in real time. Behind every screen is a machine that doesn't just record what you do. It learns how to make you repeat it again and again, until who you were is overwritten by who they need you to become. You think you're choosing? The colors on that app were tested on 1,000 rats. The sound your phone makes when you get a like, calibrated to trigger dopamine spikes just low enough to keep you craving, but never fulfilled, never full, never free. This isn't addiction. It's ritual. What the Ashford Sisters called discipline of the will is now user retention. They used iron restraints. Today, it's touchscreens, swipe loops, targeted ads, different tools, same goal, control. You wake up and check your phone. Why? Because you've been trained, ritually conditioned, to seek affirmation, fear silence, and obey invisible prompts. You have been programmed to forget the question, what do I want? Because they answered it for you, before you even ask. And this isn't just happening to you. It's happening to your children, to your neighbors, to your country. We have entered the cathedral of the algorithm, where faith is replaced by metrics, prayer by engagement, sin by noncompliance. This is the true afterlife of the Ashfords. Their theology survives in code, their discipline thrives in data, and their methods have become our everyday reality. In the silence behind the screen, there's a council, not elected, not televised, not found in textbooks or sworn into office, but more powerful than any president, more permanent than any empire, and more invisible than any enemy you've ever faced. They are the curators of consensus, the keepers of acceptable thought, the architects of the psychological perimeter you're not allowed to see, let alone cross. They wear no robes, no crowns. They sign no laws. But their work is absolute, to sculpt the soul of civilization by adjusting the knobs of perception, one microsuggestion at a time. They know which emotions destabilize a population. They know which words trigger aggression, despair, surrender. They know how to make an entire people forget who they were and accept what they're told they are. The Ashfords experimented on a few hundred women. These modern engineers, they test millions daily, in real time, using data gathered from every click, every scroll, every silence. When a protest spreads too fast, they slow it. When a voice rises too far, they bury it. When a truth gets too bright, they label it misinformation, and you believe them because they've earned your trust by controlling your fears. You see, The new institutions of control don't use chains. They use stories. Fractured, filtered. Focus, tested narratives. Designed to make you feel informed while keeping you strategically blind. You trust your feed, but it's been curated. Not for truth, for compliance. And what happens when you begin to awaken? When the patterns become visible. When you start asking questions they didn't script, you become dangerous. Not to your neighbors, not to your government, but to them, the silent order behind the curtain. So ask yourself, why is curiosity now a crime? Why is noncompliance now a diagnosis? Because in their system, self-awareness is rebellion. And rebellion must be sedated. Imagine an invisible cathedral, one not built with stone, but with code. Its priests wear no robes, they write no scripture, but their sermons control the minds of millions. They are the engineers of the sacred algorithm, the most powerful oracle of the modern age. It decides what you see, what you think, what you fear, and what you never even know existed. You don't scroll your phone. It scrolls you. The design is deliberate. Each flick of your thumb, each pause, each like is recorded. Fed into a machine not to serve you, but to train it, to sharpen it, to bind you tighter. The algorithm doesn't just know your habits. It knows your weakness. It maps your anxiety like an architect sketches blueprints, then feeds it back to you, one hyper-curated narrative at a time. A whisper of rage here, a dopamine hit there, a distraction timed perfectly between moments of awakening. It simulates free will. But behind the screen, you've already been chosen. For what you'll think, what you'll fear, what you'll fight. This is the new ritual programming, a digital reformation far more effective than any monastery or convent. The Convent of Eternal Tears isolated bodies. The algorithm isolates minds, atomizing human connection, replacing shared history with fragmented, conflicting myths. Each man becomes his own church, his own prison, his own echo chamber. And the voices you trust most online, they're often not real. Generated, amplified, directed, strategically placed to nudge you just a little deeper into the tunnel designed for you. They don't need to control the majority anymore. They only need to guide the few who guide the rest. And when a man starts to wake up, when he starts seeing through the game, refusing to react on command, questioning what he's shown, he's shadow banned, silenced, made to feel invisible. Not because he's dangerous to society, because he's dangerous to the narrative. Before there were screens, there were temples. Before there were algorithms, there were rituals. And long before a man was tracked by cookies, he was branded by symbols. The architecture of control didn't begin in Silicon Valley. It was perfected in Babylon, refined in Rome, reborn in the Convent of Eternal Tears. The Ashford Sisters understood what our modern rulers still use, that the most obedient servant is the one who believes he's being purified. In the basement chambers of the convent, every stone was placed with purpose. North-facing walls carved with sigils to confuse a sense of time. Triangular thresholds to fracture the psyche. Tight spiral staircases forcing the body into submission before the mind even resisted. This was ritual programming, not superstition, but psycho-spiritual engineering. It mirrored what Roman cults once practiced in their Mithraic temples. It mimicked what Babylonian priests performed beneath their ziggurats. And now, it's coded into your phone's interface. Swipe patterns that loop endlessly. Color schemes that mirror chakra manipulation. Notification tones that hijack your limbic system like Pavlov's bell. You don't enter a building now. You enter an app. But the architecture remains. Temples once demanded sacrifice to gain favor. Now they demand attention, the purest offering in the digital age. Every second you give it, you feed it. Every choice it suggests, and you accept. A vow. Every time you doubt yourself and look back at the screen for guidance. A ritual repeated. And just like the terrified women of the convent, you start to forget the shape of your own thoughts. You start to believe the pain is part of the healing. That your confusion is progress. That your docility is maturity. But here's the truth: you are walking the same halls, just virtually. The codes changed. The corridors didn't. And the same forces that built those ancient temples now build platforms, pushing you down the same spiral staircase until you can't tell if you're ascending or falling. It was called the Rite of White Fire, and only one written account remains. An unsigned letter sealed in wax and buried in the state archives, marked simply, "Burn if spoken aloud." But it was read and copied. And what it reveals is not just a ceremony, but a blueprint for obedience. The rite took place once every 13 months, on the coldest, blackest night of the year, in the stone chamber beneath the convent, the one no blueprints ever documented. 12 women were bound in a circle, each assigned a cardinal direction, each stripped of name and memory. In the center, a 13th seat, always empty, but never vacant. They called it the throne of absence. And according to the letter, something always sat there. Not a spirit, not a god, but what Sister Temperance once whispered was the embodiment of obedience itself. The women were not punished. They were praised for letting go, for surrendering. Each spoke aloud one truth, the deepest secret of their life. And as they spoke, the circle of sisters repeated it back in unison until the original voice was drowned, dissolved, rewritten. This wasn't confession. It was erasure. One by one, identities were stripped until all that remained was the voice of the circle, the collective, the doctrine, the script. And at the ceremony's climax, Sister Prudence would ignite a pale flame, not firewood, not oil, but a powder developed from ash, saltpeter, and something that made the flame hiss like it was alive. The white fire. It didn't consume the women. It consumed the room, every shadow, every crevice, every breath. And when it died, the women were no longer women. They were vessels, tools, obedient without memory. Now stop. Listen carefully. What system today asks you to give up your identity? To confess your sins before you're accepted? To chant the script before you're allowed to belong? You think this is ancient history? It's not. The Rite of White Fire has simply changed forms. It's in cancel culture, in groupthink, in the algorithmic demand for purity. You're not being asked to grow. You're being trained to erase yourself, and every time you submit, you light a small, invisible fire, not to warm, but to consume. Her name was Clara Hensley. She was 17, the daughter of a Boston shipwright, too curious, too willful, and far too clever to survive the world the Ashford sisters were building. She had been confined for 6 months. Her father paid for 3. But when no letter came, no progress reported, he stopped asking. Because men like him were never meant to know the truth. Clara kept a journal, but not on paper. She scratched it beneath the wooden slats of her cell with a sharpened hairpin, dipped in her own blood and candle soot. Each entry was hidden between floorboards, until, decades later, a demolition crew found them. Long after the convent had burned, most of the writing was destroyed, but one sentence survived. It wears her face now, but the voice is wrong. That single line appears 7 times throughout the writings. Each time more erratic, more jagged, more like a warning than a reflection. Clara described seeing Mother Agatha alone in the chapel one night, standing before a mirror that didn't reflect. She watched Agatha's mouth move in silence, but the echo came from behind her. Not the mirror. Behind Clara, she turned. No one was there. When she looked back, Agatha was gone, but something stood in her place, smiling. Clara began to suspect the Ashford women were no longer acting alone. That something else had taken up residence in their minds. Or perhaps something had always been there. She wrote of hearing whispers in the walls. Not words, just suggestions. Unmake yourself. Become the vessel. Empty is holy. The last phrase was found burned into the back of her wooden bed frame. Scorched with a heat source no one could identify. No fire was reported, no candles were allowed. Then, one night in 1810, the convent burned. Completely. No survivors, no cause determined. But firefighters described a strange phenomenon. The flames were white, not orange. White like magnesium, white like bone, and in the ashes, scorched into a steel drainage grate, they found 6 letters LUX-DUI, Latin, the light of God. But those who know the older tongue know the truer translation. Obedience born of fire. You were told the Ashford fire was the end. But fire isn't the end. It's the beginning of reformation through destruction. And the Ashford model didn't burn, it evolved. When the convent's remains were sifted, when the records were archived and sealed under religious protection, a handful of officials were quietly transferred. One to Boston, one to D.C., one to Yale. Those men didn't speak of what they saw, but they began to replicate it. Not the building, the system. By 1825, a new academic discipline emerged: moral treatment. It sounded compassionate. But beneath its surface was the same philosophy that governed the Ashford regime. The individual must be broken to be rebuilt in accordance with the greater good. Harvard's early psychology wing adopted these methods. So did Yale's Child Behavior Institute. By 1850, the language had changed, no longer religious, but scientific. Yet the terms were eerily familiar. Penitence became rehabilitation. Possession became hysteria. Spiritual obedience became behavioral correction. They kept the same architectural principles, too. Take a tour of early American asylums. You'll find observation cells with one-way viewing mirrors, high windows to suppress orientation, soundproof chambers labeled as quiet rooms, reinforced doors locked from the outside. Now visit a modern detention center, or a psychiatric hospital, or even an elite prep school. The design hasn't changed, only the uniform. The Ashford Sisters may be gone, but their blueprint was too effective to discard. Because it works. Because it's still working. From Ivy League halls to elite government training programs, the echoes of that convent, its architecture, its methods, its unholy goals, still shape American institutions. Wherever control is necessary, wherever conformity is demanded, wherever a mind must be retrained, reformed, or erased, the Ashford system is alive. But here's the most disturbing part. It was never just about women. That was the experiment. You are the result. And once you understand that, you start seeing it everywhere. Buried in the wooded hills of southern Pennsylvania, past where GPS loses signal and asphalt turns to gravel, sits a nondescript concrete facility labeled Pinewood Rehabilitation Center. No website, no phone number, no signage beyond a faded government plaque that simply reads, Division of Human Integration Research. To locals, it's nothing more than a defunct juvenile detention center. But Pinewood never held juveniles. Not officially. And it was never defunct. Documents unearthed through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1994, promptly reclassified within 48 hours, revealed that Pinewood was a federal behavioral engineering site, funded through a post-war psychological warfare grant, quietly authorized in 1951 under the Psychological Operations Directive No. 74, its true purpose: to test the Ashford method on non-female subjects with enhancements. This was the next phase, where the convent dealt in crude tools, isolation, ritual shaming, and surgical trauma. Pinewood perfected systematic mental recalibration. Inside, cells were soundproofed and windowless, each equipped with a looped audio system broadcasting controlled affirmations. Phrases scientifically structured to reshape identity through repetition. Some subjects were kept in complete darkness for weeks, others in perpetual light. Physical force was rarely used. They had learned what the Ashfords hinted at. You don't need chains when the mind becomes its own prison. Test groups included runaways, draft resistors, whistleblowers, and political agitators. All labeled emotionally unstable. The methods at Pinewood were later exported, not just to other black sites, but to domestic programs, education, military training, corporate onboarding, everywhere. And the origin trail, it's meticulous. The architectural plans for Pinewood, identical to the Convent of Eternal Tears, only with updated materials and ventilation specs. One internal memo even refers to the facility as Ashford Phi, signed by a man whose great-grandmother bore the name Temperance. Here's what they don't want you to grasp. This isn't a story from the past. It's not folklore. It's infrastructure. Living, breathing, evolving. Ashford was never about healing. It was never about sin. It was about control. First through religion, then through medicine, and now through systems. You want to know why you feel watched? Why your thoughts feel less your own? It's not paranoia. It's legacy. It's time we stop thinking of social media as a platform. It's not a tool for connection. It's a chamber. A digital reconstruction of the convent's basement. A seamless interface for behavioral reprogramming. Look closer. What was the core design of the Convent of Eternal Tears? Small, high windows. Reinforced doors. Endless surveillance under the guise of salvation. Total control wrapped in spiritual language. Now compare that to the feed you scroll every night. It loops endlessly, like the affirmations at Pinewood. It isolates you, rewards conformity, punishes deviation, not with whips or drills, but with silence, with invisibility. The Ashfords locked women in stone cells and called it penitence. Modern platforms lock users in feedback loops and call it freedom. But both demand the same sacrifice: your identity, your resistance, your sovereignty. Now listen carefully. The convent didn't disappear. It migrated. Its structure was digitized, its intent disguised as convenience, self-expression, and social belonging. The algorithm. That's just the newest Sister Prudence. Precise, silent, emotionless, surgical. Each time you click, swipe, or pause for just a second too long, you're not choosing. You're training it to train you. Data becomes confession. Engagement becomes flagellation. Virality becomes salvation. And the architects, many don't even know whose doctrine they follow. But a few do. A handful of legacy institutions trace their roots and their funding back to descendants of those original Ashford patrons. Families who believe in order over freedom, in ritual over reason, in design over destiny. This is no accident. It is a ritual system, just abstracted through code, pixels, and dopamine. The deepest horror. You volunteer for it every day. You log in. You surrender. You confess. And you don't even know you're kneeling. You've made it here. That alone sets you apart. Because most men, they turned back at the first scream. They flinched when truth scraped their mind like a scalpel. But not you. You've walked through every shadowed corridor of the Ashford legacy. And what you've found is not just horror, but design. Understand this. The Ashfords weren't just torturers in robes. They were the prototypes of a system that still thrives. Refined, digitized, institutionalized. They proved that ritual suffering creates obedient minds, and the world took notes. Education became indoctrination. Therapy became sedation. Entertainment became hypnosis. Even your aspirations, the house, the career, the six-pack, the hustle, are often just more sophisticated cages. You were taught to want things that keep you docile, to measure yourself with mirrors they control, to reject anything not stamped with their approval. But today, you've broken something. Not the system, yet, but the spell, and that is where real danger begins and real power awakens. Because now you can see what they cannot hide, that behind every doctrine of obedience, there is fear. Their fear. Fear that you'll unlearn the script. Fear that you'll reclaim your perception. Fear that you'll become unpredictable again. They don't fear warriors. They fear rememberers. Men who trace the scars of their ancestors and say, "It ends with me." So if this journey ignited something in you, don't let it flicker out. Comment now, no more sisters. No more cells. Say it twice, not just for the algorithm, but to mark this as a threshold. Because from this point forward, you are no longer the man who didn't know. You are the man who cannot forget. The man who saw the walls and chose the door. This isn't just the end of the Ashford tale. It's the beginning of yours. Walk wisely. And never stop asking who built the room, and why were you born inside it. End of transmission.